So Brent Staples argues that the A is too easy to earn, especially in colleges, where it seems more of a threat system, it seems more of an automatic system that you get an A because of all these like risks that are tied to both student and professors, right? So perhaps then this grading scale has an issue to itself altogether. Which brings us back to then what the inherent purpose of education is, right? Because if it's true, you can disagree with it, obviously, right? But if it's true that the A is too easy to earn in college, maybe even high school, grade school, whatever, then what is the point of education where no one's really learning, maybe, where the enrichment of students isn't happening, where we're kind of just funneled through to get this A and nothing else, then has education really done its job as the years go by? So I want to kind of go over a little bit of history on education here, this 400-year practice, institution, and system in America, just to kind of like bring us towards the prompt I'm going to have you think about today here, and to argue from your own observations, from your own experiences, from whatever readings and learnings you have, what then is education's purpose in society here? And to begin this journey, we're going to go way back, right? We're going to go all the way back to the beginning here to its exclusive time period here. So back in colonial times, only sons of the rich require schooling. And we're looking at American schooling, obviously. We're not looking at like this international scope of schooling yet. We're going to go into that. But at least in the very beginning, it was only for the elite, right? Only for those who had like, quote, a future because their parents were already successful. So they're going to move up their kids as successes for their fortunes, for their heritage and all that there. So it was only for a small handful of people. Everyone else was doing more like trade stuff or doing more like, I guess, like manual labor jobs and what have you. And then slowly, as it became more inclusive, it became something that was a norm in society to the point where everyone was involved, right? So before it was for like a smaller handful of people, and then eventually became something that even involved the parents. So if you think about today, right, like your parents are also like stakeholders within this education system, because if you don't go to school, for example, they get in trouble. They have to put you through schooling usually because it's kind of like this mandate that kind of exists with our society, like a indirect mandate. Everyone would definitely stigmatize you or question you if you didn't go to school. So in this case, it comes from this time period here. First law, 1642, it chastised parents for not attending to the learning of their young. So in this case, it made sure that parents were also tied to this whole education system. If your kids didn't attend, if your kids weren't paying enough attention to school, if they weren't like trying their hardest, whatever, then later the parents would also get in trouble. I'd be shamed for that, right? Be publicly shamed for that. So the parents were like, well, I don't want to get shamed. So they're going to basically enforce their kids through it. The second law, 1647, did much to formalize schooling. Every town with 50 household would appoint one person to teach all children to read and write. So this again is the norming of it, right? Because back then it was only for like a small handful of people. It was almost like tutorship in some ways. Like you had these institutions for schools, but it was more like a tutoring of a small handful of people. Now it's every 50 kids would have one person teach. Sorry, not 50 kids, 50 households would have one person to teach these kids, essentially, right? So it was something that everyone was trying to create as a stabilized system, that there was someone to take care of and to push on. And then the town was required to pay the wages of the teacher. So in this case, a tax was created for the teacher to teach, obviously not for free. They're not going to be selfless like that. There's still survivability needed here. So these kids are now taken care of, and the parents are now also tied to it here. There are types of education. We are trying to go into new school education, obviously, right? And it doesn't mean new and old as in like technology and all that. It's more of like what its approach is. So old school education looks something like this here. On the one hand, there was dame school. So this is more for little girls here. And essentially in dame school, it was to learn a mannerism. It was to learn how to be a certain way, to cook and clean, to take care of things, to essentially just be the mother figure later on, right? Skills you would need to have, and also the temperament that you would need for it there. So when we talk about old school, it's more about like not so much creativity, more about just like grinding a certain lifestyle or mentality or what have you there. Town schools, similar thing, where everyone was basically facing forward, one teacher in the room, desks, chairs, memorize this, memorize that. So very much like dame schools, town schools were about content knowledge now, but it was still memorization, right? It wasn't like you were trying to have discussions or anything that was kind of like profound and out there. You were trying to change the world. You were trying to like learn these things that everyone should know and then later progress from there. Secondary education is where it gets a little bit fancier. So secondary education is high school essentially, right? And secondary education was back then only for men. So all boys and girls would go to schooling, but then later only the men would advance to secondary education and on because women were like, yeah, well, middle school is enough for you essentially, right? And then you had enough smarts to take care of the household. But later on, women did obviously go into secondary educations. But it's here that you get a little bit more of what we see today. So you get the math, you get the science, you get the English, you get the history. You get more of a diverse, what do you call it? Platter of education here. So it was trying to make a more well-rounded person, right, that would possibly go into this or go into that. It gave you like career opportunities rather than force you into like a funnel of an idea there. So education there was trying to get people thinking about what they could be in the future if you were part of the elite, if you're part of the like, rich upper class there. Different intellects had different thoughts regarding education. Benjamin Franklin, he believed this. He believed that an education that would lead to mastery of process rather than rote learning. So he was kind of against the old school. He was hoping that one day education would be more of like actually comprehending things and then later applying it and later developing new stuff, right? And he also believed that people could better themselves. So that over time through education, you'd be wiser, you would have your smarts to tackle the world better. It wasn't just for memorization, obviously. It was just for this sort of ability to cope with all different troubles in society there. So his is more open-ended. His is a little bit more like, I guess, public friendly. Jefferson was a little bit more controversial. He called for 3 years of free education for all white children. So he didn't believe in equality of education for all races, not even for women. He believed that it was exclusive for usually white males. Believed that informed citizens would make better decisions, enlightened thinking. So for him, he believed that kind of like Benjamin, right? He believed that through education, people could make more rational decisions and to logically push society for a better position. But then he also thought that not everyone's going to make it. He thought that 1 in 20 would go into further education, and that it was part of that aristocracy, right? That if you had everybody moving forward, then later it kind of like waters down education. So for him, he thought like, okay, it'd be like 1 out of 20 for the people who really decide and change society and to make a difference, essentially. So he was a little bit more limiting in terms of who he was accepting. There's actually kind of I can't have the exact quote, but there's actually something that's very critical. He said where he believed that education is to separate the diamonds from the coals. So he believed that most people were coals, right? People that weren't worth investing in. And then later you would find the diamond in the rough, essentially. And basically, well, let that person succeed and not everybody else. So he was very pick and choose for education there. So that was the old school views of education, or the old premises of education, right? But as time goes on, there were different views toward different groups, different inclusions, different types of immigrants were also coming over. So how do you factor all these different groups also into education here? So for African Americans, obviously it was way later and different in terms of what mainstream America wanted versus what African Americans wanted, right? So they didn't give education to African Americans early on because literacy was not connected with work. So it wasn't allowed, right? Because if you were just simply like cutting wood or you're taking care of the fields and all that, then did you really need an education? No. So they limited because of that. They also feared that literacy would lead to insurrection. So they would also hold back because they knew that with literacy, they can form ideas and to form organizations. And lastly, some blacks were managed to learn arts and skills as carpenters, coopers, farriers, wainwrights, and all that. But even then, you had to go through like a trade school first before you were deemed maybe worthy of learning. So education has had its barriers, for sure. Not just Jefferson with thinking like 1 out of 20 would make it. Education has always kind of thought of certain people being the successors and some being the lessers, right? And my point with all this so far is, if you think about the A system that Staples was mentioning in his article here, we have had many issues with education here, not just with grading. Grading's a part of it too, but it's like we can never really figure out where the perfect education lies, right? And if we look at historically, we can also see that education has also been a large work in progress. It was racist, it was sexist, it was really kind of just figuring out what we needed to push the majority of Americans forward for the better of society there. For women, same thing. It was really sexist, actually. They thought that education would hurt women because it was biologically harmful. Okay, why? Because they argued that it was too stressful and that the woman would be like, destroyed by how stressful. I don't know. Old people, weird views on the times. Even education split based on geography. For the North, they believe that it was more of an experience. It was more of something that was inclusive, something that was more diverse, something that was more kind of what we see today, you know what I mean, for education. It was something more of like you would go there, go through your experiences, get an education, move on. Everyone's being enriched. Whereas for the South, it wasn't quite that case yet. The South took a little longer to kind of catch up to that. They were mostly still thinking that education was exclusive for the upper class, and education was provided by tutors who were from a weird variety of people here: indentured servants, divinity students, poor second sons of aristocrats, convicts even, right? So education, it had a really big jarring split in the South, kind of like what we do have today as well between like private institutions and public institutions here. But otherwise, it was also seen as like an arts. Education was seen as something that was classical study for boys, dancing and all that, and then later girls mastered like the social graces, how to present themselves in society. So it still clung to a lot of like old school ideas in the South. And these two worlds would eventually mix and kind of like blend into what we see today for education. A couple of notable people for education: Horace Mann. He led for the movement that is free public education. And he argued that we do need to have that because it would allow equalization for all, right? It would allow for everybody to get a chance and to, well, make their own steps in society there. Rather than being excluded to those on the very top, everyone gets a fair playing ground to push, again, society for the better here. John Dewey, if you know the Dewey Decimal System, same guy, the guy who established it basically, he saw that education was an instrument for change. That if you had an educated society, it would allow for democracy to flourish and for people to actually know what they're voting for and participating in and get a better view of society in its entirety there. If you also wondered why education is limited to the whole like math, English, science, and all that, blame these guys, the Committee of 10. Basically, these old dudes here decided way back that to have a balanced education, you need to have these different subjects, right? The A through G's, essentially. So it was their decision process, it was their rationale that we still cling on to, that we have these, major subjects that we all buy into today. So I know we all have like different preferences for things that should be part of education, right? Things like arts, for example, things like even like hands-on work, life skills. They're not included because the Committee of 10 thought, you know what, this is what we should all have our students learn, essentially. As time goes on, society decides to collectively agree that we need tax for schools. So if you think about like the very beginning when like they would have society pay for that one teacher for like the 50 households, right? People thought, you know what, I'm going to invest in education as a society too, right? We're all going to basically put in and chip in here, and we should all come to an agreement as to what students should study. And it goes into classical modern languages, English, mathematics, history, and all that, what we call liberal arts. So as people were putting their money in, everyone was also collectively agreeing on what we should learn in education. So education hasn't done good. Yeah, it has, but it has a lot of stemming problems too, right? For example, there was segregation that still exists more so today than ever. Actually, if you look at some studies from segregation then versus now, we're actually more segregated today than we were even like a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Because if you think about how money works and how neighborhoods work, particular neighborhoods will have particular types of students and different types of institutions and environments and resources versus other ones. So we're actually a lot more segregated than we think we are. Also, in education, it's standardized, right? We have this fear, this struggle and toil of standardized education where it all goes into these arbitrary tests. And at the same time, education also is a very big social struggle because you never really know how to take care of everyone's issues, mental, emotional, even their background, their family backgrounds that go into education. So it really makes for a controversial system in itself. Inclusion and mobility is a big thing with education that we associate with because everyone can access education, but then later everyone also only knows education nowadays as mobility, right? Back then, the ideas of education were to like get enrichment, to feel better about oneself, to find passions, but now it's more like you get this degree, you get this money here. So based on this chart, as you can see, most people who are with particular degrees, as they go on, are more employed, make more money. If you have less than a high school degree, usually you can't get much in society here. So it seems to be a society that really invests itself in education here. This scrap of paper, this degree that is issued out here, that correlates with apparently mastery and competency, right? That we all acknowledge here. It also kind of like fuels our class system because different schools have different class to them, different people who go to different jobs have different class into them. So education has, again, progressed people as a whole, but it also creates the rationale for why you are in the place you are today. It's the limiter as well as to your successes. And today we try to be more and more progressive with education, but it's still a struggle, right? Like not everyone has really bought into it quite yet. There are still fights to be made. There are still people who are not quite represented. I mean, even our texts for education are very, very limiting with the perspective that we get. So with education as a whole, how can we get to the level that includes everyone truly, right? And it's not even a universal access because not everyone also gets access to education the way that we would like to. Education is actually not a right. I mean, we would like to believe that education is a right, but it's actually... well, it's just a privilege. There's no law that suggests that you have to be in education or get an education here. You get punished if you don't, ironically. But there is no right that guarantees you a quality education. It's really dependent on states as well. It's dependent on where you live as well. So there's not really, quote unquote, a universal access to good education, at least there. And it gets more complicated as more and more people come in because even though more and more education is offered for immigrants coming to America, a lot of immigrants also feel that barrier to education and the success that comes with it, right? Because of their own backgrounds, because of what they came in with the limitations of, but also of what access they have while in America. And education's also kind of like a hard moral boost because its intentions are to get everyone like buying into it, right? Everyone's going to want to get into education and to, I guess, be competitive and to be self-reflective and try for the best. But I don't know, maybe it doesn't always end up with success, right? Not everyone makes it through the questions of this inner strife and struggle and really makes it out as a whole. Not everyone's going to be like, well, yeah, K through 12 really helped me and really got me to where I am today. Not really. A lot of people don't really owe their success to education as well. So, education as a whole. It's imperfect, but we have to acknowledge it's experimental. As quote by Mary McLeod Bethune, education is the great American adventure, the world's most colossal democratic experiment. It is true. As America stands by itself as well, it's always been one experiment, right? How can you get all the different types of people in with the best possible access and resources while working with so little, honestly? You know what I mean? That's the kind of silver lining of education here. And it's sad because as much as we would like to hope that American education is successful, in recent years, more than 30 million adults in the United States cannot read, write, or do basic math above a third grade level. Children whose parents have low literacy levels have a 72% chance of being at the lowest reading levels themselves. And 75% of state prison inmates did not complete high school or can be classified as low literate. Low literacy is said to be connected to over $230 billion a year in healthcare costs because almost half of Americans cannot read well enough to comprehend health information, incurring higher costs. So if you don't have a good education, then you also have all its negative trade-offs, right? That you can't just say, like, let's not have any education and see how that goes. No, there is something that seems to... There needs to be a foundation of some form. But that foundation that we have in America is still very, very experimental and shaky and broken altogether there. And again, like I mentioned here, as you add immigration to the mix, right? A lot of immigrants don't really get into that pool of success. The report claims that 1 in 3 people in the U.S. drop out of high school and that 1 in 4 American families is low income with parents who lack education and skills to improve their economic status. Like, how can you expect people who didn't have that background to succeed? You know, That's really tricky of how we deal with that ongoing issue. And we can see it immediately within our own kind of, circumstances too, that you have often, I'm assuming most of you too, have parents who have a difficulty reading and writing, who don't have English as a language mastered, and therefore you become the translators. But then later, you also have your own struggles of what that means, or the legalities of things, right? So America hasn't really done a great job when it deals with these ongoing and new issues too. So those who succeed and those who don't, both are pushed through the system. The question is that fair? I don't know. We don't really have an answer for that yet, right? Everyone makes it through the same 12 years of K through 12. Not everyone. People go through college, but then later everyone has their own different results, right? The education system isn't really like balanced when it comes to the outcomes there. And I mean, we see it even in the immediate situations that there is a stark difference of resources between classrooms. That sometimes you're going to be in a classroom that is scheduled, orderly, planned out versus ones that are constantly in chaos, right? So it's even like a crap shot in terms of what you get as an education, of the students that you're with, of what kind of teacher you have. Everything's random at a certain degree here. I threw a lot at you, but my point is this prompt here that I want you to tackle. Prompt. Education has been a long-held institution in most major civilizations as a means of intellectual and social progress. As modern education solidifies what works and what doesn't, Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who studied how children develop, had this to say about education. He says, quote, "The principal goal of education in the schools should be creating men and women who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done. Men and women who are creative, inventive, and discoverers, who can be critical and verify, and not accept everything they are offered." That was the principal goal of education. Question for you. To what degree do you agree with Piaget's views on education? And to what degree do you believe his views are applied in education today? So, in short, I'm going to have you evaluate education from your own experience, from what it could be, from what it isn't, from what other people maybe are doing around the country here. How would you measure education based on Piaget's view here in his quote? That's my challenge for you to consider.